Our next speaker is Kim Stallwood, who has been actively involved in the work of several animal advocacy organizations in the UK and the United States for more than 35 years. He is an independent scholar and author on animal rights topics. In his presentation, Kim will talk about his book, Life Lessons, Hard Truth and Bold Strategies from an Animal Advocate. In this book, Kim seeks to discover why animals are important to him and what living as a vegan animal rights advocate means. Please welcome Kim Stallwood.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I want to, first of all, thank everyone involved with the organizing of the conference. It's gone incredibly well, very impressive program of speakers. And I want to add my appreciation for all their hard work to everyone else who has said so much so far. And I've just had a cup of coffee, as well as having a delicious lunch, and my first ever Buccaneer bar. So I'm ready to go. I won't be held responsible for whatever I now say or do up on the stage. If I speak too fast, please wave or let me know or shout out. And I want to make sure there's time for questions and answers after, and I'm here throughout the rest of the conference. So if you please come up and talk to me if you don't get a chance to ask a question this afternoon. Last time when I was here, I gave a very dry paper about the social movement for animals and talked about balancing utopian vision with pragmatic politics and critiquing the animal rights movement. This year I want to do something slightly different, and what's happened between now and last year is that my book, Growl, has been published, and I have copies with me and it's been available on the bookstall. So this talk is a bit more informal, a bit more personal, and a bit more about what I talk about in Growl. So I hope that you enjoy this, and maybe even you might want to think about buying the book, and I have copies with me by chance. So when I think about being a vegan animal rights activist all this time, I like to think about who we are, what we're trying to do, and where are we going. And these are images which, for me, speak to what it means to care deeply about animals. And in Growl, what I try to do is have two parallel narrative arcs in the books. First is, it's a memoir of my involvement with various animal organizations and how I got involved, how animals began to matter to me. And it took me a long while to figure out that I shouldn't eat meat and that I should be a vegan. And then the second arc is about 4 key values that I now believe are at the cornerstone of what it means to care deeply about animals and what animal rights mean. So this talk is going to, in a way, mirror the book in the sense that I'm going to discuss these 4 key values of animal rights and talk about who we are and what do we believe. And in many respects, my talk, I think, is going to complement those presentations made previously by Liz Tyson and Lisa Kemmerer. So in these images, they speak to me about one characterization which I think is the personification of being an animal rights advocate, and that we are a witness for the animals. And the theme of the talk is indeed animal witness. And you can see in the top right-hand corner, I don't know where this photograph came from. I found it on the internet, and it just speaks to me so fundamentally of what it means to care deeply about animals. I can feel myself welling up even thinking about the photograph. I don't know what the circumstances are, but clearly there is something profoundly important and moving happening between the dog and that lady. And that relationship is the relationship I think that we want to have between and among all of us, regardless of species. And in the bottom left-hand corner is the action of the Animal Liberation Group in Australia, who pioneered one of my two favorite forms of protest for animals, and that's open rescue. Open rescue, where people go in, identified into where places where animals are abused, and they document where the animal abuse is happening, and they bring the information out to show to the public. And it's a form of animal witnessing. They also rescue some of the animals and give first aid to those animals there. And then in the bottom right and top left are two examples of the protests which Animal Equality pioneered, which is another form of witnessing for animals. And I find these images profoundly moving as well, where we basically represent back to society the consumption of animals. And it's done for me in a way which I find very respectful and profoundly moving. So this is the cover of the book, Growl. And what the designers of the book cover did, which you can't quite see, is on the left-hand side in the red are battery cages, and then on the right-hand side are books on a shelf in my office in England. And in a way, I'm sort of imprisoned between the two. But Growl is meant to be part memoir, part manifesto. And the four key values that I discuss in Growl are compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. Wait a moment. Okay. All right. So these four key values are the distillation of years that I've been thinking and being active on this issue. So compassion, our motivation for helping animals. Truth, our ethical relations with animals. Nonviolence, our values and the relations we have with animals. And justice, our commitment to all animals. So I'll now sort of spend a bit of time talking about each one. This lady, her name was Canberra Kate. Her real name was Kate Ward, but she was known as Canberra Kate. Canberra is a town in Surrey, south of London, where I was born and raised. And I remember as a child, when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, this lady pushing that wooden cart up Campbell's High Street against the one-way traffic. And she is what we would now consider, Liz, an animal rights activist from the description that we talked about yesterday, or that you talked about yesterday. I was very young. I was very afraid of her. I never spoke to her. But I remember very clearly, and I can remember the cart and all these dogs, and the traffic all stopping and negotiating around her, people standing on the pavement, on the sidewalk, watching her go past. And she made me think about what is it that people have about animals? What is this relationship with animals? Why does she do what she does? So in writing the book, I went back and researched her. And it turns out that she's an extraordinary person. She was a working class, single woman who for decades lived in a very small house in Camberley and rescued dogs. She had very little money, but what money that she had, she spent on looking after the dogs. And also she gave money, secretly it turns out, to human charities as well. So I think that in a way, those of us who share our lives with rescued animals of various kinds, there's a bit of Canberra Kate in all of us. There's a bit of Canberra Kate whereby we take in these animals who are refugees and we give them our homes for the remainder of their lives. And I always get a bit irritated when people say, oh, you animal rights people, you don't believe in people having pets. And I don't know about you, but I've never met a bunch of people who care more passionately about the animals in their lives than animal rights people. So, you know, I think probably if I asked who in this room does not have a rescued animal at home? Oh dear, I'm putting my theory to test here, there's probably about 10–15% of you, I'd guess. So I'll take it that not everyone is in a position to have an animal at home. So I always think that we need to not be shy about the fact that we are, at heart, forgive the phrase, animal lovers. That we would do anything for the animals in our lives. So Canberra Kate had a profound impact upon me. And she, the seed of compassion that I witnessed in her, lay dormant in me for a very long time. She didn't provoke me to becoming a vegetarian or a vegan or be involved with animal groups. I did join the RSPCA as a child, but it was really just a token membership. And compassion, I think, is what we saw with Canberra Kate. And the reason why I chose compassion rather than pity or empathy or sympathy is because with compassion, it's an emotional connection to someone else and feeling what they're feeling, but being motivated to want to do something about it. And that's the key thing for me about compassion. It's the motivation to want to do something about it. We can feel what that other being is feeling, and it's not just sympathy where we can sympathize with it and then walk away. Compassion means that we are compelled to take action. And so we witness what happens to animals, and we are compelled to do something about it. We can't stop it. And I'm going to come back to that point in a little while. So this talk, I promise you, doesn't have a lot of pictures of animal suffering. But the reason why this is up here is because when I was a student in the early 1970s, learning how to run hotels and restaurants, I worked in a chicken slaughterhouse. And I didn't work on the chicken slaughterhouse on the killing part, the production line. It was on the post-killing part. But I still could never bring myself to watch the killing. I knew it was happening. I could smell it. I could hear it to a certain extent. And I was a student. I knew this job would be from the summer of '73, and that I'd be going back to college in the autumn of at the end of '73. And it bothered me, but it didn't bother me enough that I didn't do it or stopped doing it. But it bothered me to the extent that when chickens killed at the slaughterhouse were sold cheaply to the workers on a Friday afternoon, I could never bring myself to buy any of those chickens. But I did cook and eat chickens from other sources. Now, go figure. You know, that's one of those irrational but rational things that we do when we try to resolve and reconcile ourselves with understanding what's happening to animals. And this, in a way, leads us to the second key value of truth. Truth in the sense of understanding our ethical relations with animals. Once we become aware and we see the truth of our relations with animals, there's no stopping. There's just no turning back. Once we've discovered the truth and the reality of what's going on, it's very hard to turn back the time and pretend it doesn't happen. Some people do that, but I think that subconsciously it's still going on in their minds. And what our jobs are, partly as animal rights people, is to keep that presence forward in their minds. So truth is a key value for me in animal rights. We are telling the truth about our relations with animals, all their complexity, the confused state that they are, contradictions. And now I want to turn to talking about various studies that have been made to try and articulate who we are as animal advocates, as animal rights. And there's two types that I want to talk about. One is called caring sleuths. A caring sleuth was conceived by a colleague, a psychologist in America called Ken Shapiro. And he came up with the idea that animal advocates are a combination of someone who seeks out suffering, animal suffering, like a detective, but on the other hand also takes action about it. He saw caring sleuths as a sort of combination of Sherlock Holmes in seeking it out, discovering where it is, and Mother Teresa, someone who wanted to give succor to those who needed it. So caring sleuths have 5 characteristics. we care. We care about animals and what happens to them. And in the caring, we see their suffering. And seeing their suffering, we seek out their suffering. And in seeking out their suffering, we embody it, we become it, we experience it. So when we started this talk with those 4 photographs, and there's that lady hugging the dog, we immediately know, we go to that place where she is, because we've been there, we know what she's feeling. So there's a pervasiveness of the suffering. But in seeking it out and seeing it and embedding it into our lives and how we live and what we think, inevitably that leads to tensions and conflicts, because not everyone else feels the same way as we do. They don't feel the same way as deeply as we do about animals. So these are the characteristics of a caring sleuth, and it's a good way to think about ourselves. The next type that I'd like to talk about is by Tom Regan, the philosopher who wrote The Case for Animal Rights. He wrote a very good book called Empty Cages, which I would recommend also. It's more of a popularly styled written book. There is philosophy in it, but it's not a philosophical treatise in the way that The Case for Animal Rights is. And he talked about 3 different types of animal advocates. The DaVincians, after Leonardo da Vinci, who are born with a special connection with animals, intuitively that it's always been within them from as early as they can remember. Damascens, they experience a transformative moment about their perception of animals. Something profound happens which brings the realization of the truth about our relationship with animals forward, and there's no turning back. Their lives are transformed, their lives are changed. And then muddlers, who sort of grow into animal consciousness step by step. I think I'm a bit of a muddler in that I'm certainly not Damascan. I wasn't born with an innate sense of animals. I don't think I had a Da Vincian moment. Not even working in the chicken slaughterhouse was a major turning point in of itself at that time. Eventually, it did play a pivotal moment. So I'm a muddler. I think I sort of grown over the years to understanding what animal rights and how we treat animals. And I'm always curious to know, do you identify with one or more of these? Can you say to yourself, you think, I'm a bit of a muddler too, but I had a Da Vincian moment when I saw such and such. Does this all resonate with you? I see some people nodding. Can someone actually say yes, maybe? Okay, good. You haven't all gone to sleep then. So in knowing about animal cruelty and exploitation and embedding it into ourselves and feeling about the oppressive weight of knowing and feeling about animal cruelty and exploitation. And I think it's even gotten worse now because most of us probably spend time on the computer where we're constantly bombarded with images of animal cruelty and exploitation from around the world. All that information that's hitting us all the time about animal cruelty and to a certain extent our inability to actually do anything about it, where does that put us? And I know for me, where it puts me, and this photograph represents this, it puts me periodically into what I call the misanthropic bunker. So here's a photograph that could be me, looking from the back, not a very flattering photograph, but there you are, of me storming down the tube to the path, to the tunnel, to the misanthropic bunker. There it is down the end. And I'm sure, if we're all honest, we've all been in the misanthropic bunker. Thank you. That's known as audience participation. Or in your case, audience inanticipation. Anyway, so the misanthropic bunker. We go there because we're really fed up with people, we hate people, we despise them, we hate what they do to animals, it's also hopeless, nothing is going to get better. Why can't we just blow the world up or get rid of all the people, etc., etc., etc.? I've been there, and I periodically still go there. And what I now believe is that it's actually okay to go to the misanthropic bunker every now and then, because I think in a way it's kind of therapeutic. There's nothing wrong with sort of having a rant with someone who'll let you have a rant because you're just sort of fed up with everything and you're fed up with everyone, and there's so much animal cruelty. How can we live our lives, live with ourselves? But I think you've also got to get yourself out of it, because there's no good will ever come, I think, from being inside the misanthropic bunker. You've got to get out of it, because you've got to get back speaking out for animals in a way that's going to connect with people. And in talking to people about animals, I think it's important to understand the animal ethics, the different philosophies. Now, I know that other speakers, including Lisa, have been touching upon this, so I'm only going to do this briefly. But for me, these are the three primary aspects of animal ethics, of thinking about the philosophy of animal rights, although animal rights in particular is a loaded, problematic term. And the three are utilitarianism, natural rights, and ecofeminism. And over the years, I've been fortunate to see the development of each of these, and how as each one has come along, they've challenged what preceded them. And I now think that, depending upon the circumstances, one is more fitting than the other. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes looking at each one to remind ourselves of them. And the most important work about utilitarianism is Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. And if you haven't read that, I really recommend that you do. It's an important book. But also, there's a second book he wrote. We wrote many books. But there's a second book I like to recommend of his called Practical Ethics, which situates different ethical issues within his utilitarian philosophy. So utilitarianism is the measuring up of good versus bad, basically. And we use that utilitarian summing up of decision-making often without really knowing that we're doing it. Is it better for me to do X rather than Y? Then Natural Rights by Tom Regan. This is one of the covers of the Case for Animal Rights. This is where he argues that animals are subjects of a life. They're not objects. They're not this microphone. They are sentient beings, and because they're sentient beings, they're subjects of a life. And as they are subjects of a life, they have inherent rights. And he therefore makes the case that utilitarianism is at fault because it could mean that in making a utilitarian calculation that you don't have to be required to include the circumstances of animals in your decision-making. Whereas Singer does make that case, Regan says that that's actually optional. Whereas if we had the concept of rights, moral rights for animals, then there is no choice in the matter. And moral rights leads to legal rights. But then more recently, after the development of utilitarianism and rights view, is ecofeminism, which Lisa spoke about yesterday. And ecofeminism is this bringing together of environmental thinking, ecological thinking with feminism. And as Lisa explained yesterday, I'm not going to go into it in detail now. She did it so well yesterday. I really enjoyed that talk. She spoke about how there's the other, there's white men, and then there's the rest, the other. And ecofeminism critiques both the rights view and the utilitarian view because they, in their way, are extensions of patriarchy. And really what's at the heart of the challenges we face is challenging patriarchy. So I have very quickly gone through these aspects of animal ethics because I am a great believer in doing the work that's necessary to be done to understand animal ethics. Because with understanding animal ethics, you are more informed, your understanding is deeper, and consequently you're going to be more confident and more able to make the case for animals. And I do get a bit irritated by some people involved with animal rights who say, oh, I don't need to read this stuff. And they always remind me of people who aren't vegan who say, oh, don't tell me about it. You know, ignorance is bliss, but I think that we need to get rid of that bliss because we need to be better educated to be able to articulate more than just in an emotional way what we're arguing for. So in writing Growl, I've looked back over my life and the various things that I've done. You can see a much younger version of me working with the police in I can't remember where that photograph was. I think that was Salisbury. In the early 1980s, doing demonstrations, large national demonstrations with the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. In the bottom right-hand corner, with my colleague Jill Church, when I edited a magazine called The Animal's Agenda, interviewed Paul McCartney, and at the top there, I'm actually wearing a vegan set of leathers on a motorbike, on a Harley Davidson, because we had a section in the magazine which was called I Can't Believe It's Vegan. The things one does for animal rights. But here's another set of photographs which are with the dogs who have been in my life, me and my partner's life. And I want to return to the point about the fact that I think that we should think about reclaiming the name animal lover. It has been, is that 30 minutes? Thank you. It has been a phrase that has been rather trashed over the years. And to be quite honest with you, I would say, I remember saying quite clearly that I didn't ever consider myself to be an animal lover because it was all about respect for animals, it was about their moral and legal status for animals. In doing so, I found that, looking back, that it was an abstraction. It was a disconnect. And what happened when these dogs, first the dog on the left there, Booba, when he came into my life in Washington, D.C., he began the process of putting flesh and blood onto my understanding of what it meant to care deeply about animals. Booba was a Chihuahua who bit everyone. And because he bit everyone, of course, I thought he was wonderful. The top right is Bambino on the right, and then Annabelle, otherwise known as Piggy and Beano, and the one below is Honey. Honey, those three came together as a group, and Honey weighed 4 pounds, and you can see that she's got the sleeves of a sweatshirt cut up to make a coat for her because we couldn't find a dog coat to buy that was ever small enough for her. And they all live with us. But what they did for me was put a flesh and blood understanding of what it means to care deeply about animals. And that understanding, I think, made me a better person for animal rights. Because, in part, they helped me understand the importance of nonviolence in the sense that we need to be... I agree with very much, I'm sort of jumping around, I agree very much with the new wave of activism that's going on, originating in Southern California, of positioning the consumption of animals for food as an act of violence. And I think more generally, the way in which we treat animals by the animal industrial complex is violent. We don't see it as violence, but it is violence. We now see it as violence because we've had the Damascenean moment or the Da Vincian, we've been a Da Vincian, or we've muddled our way through. And how do we stop such institutionalized endemic violence? Well, we become vegan, we become animal rights, we remove the violence from our lives. But I think there's actually more than just removing the violent products that we buy from our lives. We've got to go beyond that, and that we've got to think, breathe, live, speak, engage with others in non-violent ways. So over the years, my feelings about direct action for animals has changed. And there probably isn't time for me to sort of go into that now, but it's changed to the point where I feel very strongly that the animal rights movement needs to be very much a non-violent movement in all ways. And that's one reason why I chose at the beginning to start the presentation with those photographs of the animal equality protests, their form of animal witnessing, and the open rescues, because to me they are personification of true non-violent action. And the last key value is justice, which is our commitment for animals. And justice, I would put as the umbrella over understanding animal ethics, which also fits under the title of truth as well. And in justice, in the sense that there's an equality to the aspect of justice, to ensure that the law recognizes animals like humans as sentient beings in their own right, in order for them to receive their due legal protection. One of my frustrations with the animal rights movement is our inability thus far to really develop ourselves into being a social political movement. And presentation last year, which is available on YouTube to watch, I talked more deeply about making animal rights a mainstream political issue. And then justice is a fairness issue, to require the law to protect animals appropriate to their needs as subjects of a life with inherent rights. And then duty, to insist that individuals and society respect and enforce justice for animals. 5 minutes, gosh. So, as a social movement, briefly recapping last year, I talked about the 5 stages. And I think that we progress through those 5 stages of public education, public policy, legislation, enforcement, and public support, in the way in which we individually progress through stages to become animal rights advocates and continue to develop in our thinking and feeling. We, as a social movement, need to go beyond, I think, campaigning for optional cruelty-free lifestyles. We've got to embed the values of animal rights into the mainstream political arena. So then, to begin to conclude, these four key values of compassion, truth, non-violence, and justice are at heart what I think that we believe. Now, this is my take on it, and you may say to me, that's rubbish, Stallwood. You know, I don't agree with you at all. I think there's actually something else, or I think you combine two together. That's fine. You can develop, and I would recommend you think about this, develop your own key values as to why you do and believe what you do. Because I think they will help, like a signpost, give you further direction and clarification on your actions for animals. And with that, I'm going to leave you with Growl. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions now. Are there any questions? See your hand back there, and then I'll come over to you. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Kim. Thank you. That was very interesting. Just 2 points that I just wanted to bring up for your view, I suppose, and just sort of as a comment as well. In one of the last slides that you showed, you talked about in the levels of, you know, sorry, I don't really know how to explain it, but you mentioned legislation, then enforcement, then public support. But I wonder, would public support be best placed at stage 3, with legislation and enforcement then coming after it? And as an example, when you think about, say, for example, equal rights for marriage, it was only after there was widespread public support for that legislation and consequently enforcement came about. So I wonder whether it might make sense to put public support to stage 3. And also just an observation on my part in relation to the first slide, where you showed pictures of animal activists, and you know, one of the activisms that they were involved in was holding dead bodies of animals. And what always struck me as strange in relation to that was that at all times I think they seemed to be wearing gloves. And I presume, am I correct to note that they were wearing gloves? And if so, I presume it has to do with hygiene. But I wonder, is that not then placing this sort of, you know, I mean, would you do that if you were holding the dead body of a fellow human being? You wouldn't. You would hold their body with your bare hands. And I wonder why it was chosen not to hold the body of these dead animals with bare hands. I think symbolically that would have a greater impact, in my opinion. Thank you.
I don't think I can answer your question about gloves in the animal equality protest. I think they need to address that issue for you, and I don't know if Sharon is in the room, but she can answer that question for you more fully than I can. With respect to, I suspect it's because it's of a hygiene issue, the reason why they're wearing those gloves. With respect to the stages, I take your point very much. I'm not going to agree with you about moving it to stage 3, but what I will say, because I think that often what happens with an issue is that it goes from public unawareness to public awareness, to the point where everyone goes around saying, nearly everyone goes around saying, oh, that's what we always thought all along. But in reality, they didn't. But what will happen is that there's a critical mass is going to happen where there is going to be a turning point where legislation and public policy will come more rushing forward, as it has done with gay marriage issues, for example. But gay marriage issues has become legislated on, but still there are quite significant numbers of percentages of the population who don't support it. So I think there is an argument to be made, and I will stand by it, that public education should be at the end, because you're going to go from a situation where most people don't understand it to most people accepting it, and in part they've accepted it because they've had to, because the law has addressed it.
Okay, what was the next question again over here somewhere? You raised your hand, sorry.
Yes, I do agree that we now need to become a politically social movement and to move the animal rights on. But is there a political agenda in the first place to move forward? Have we actually got a political agenda in the first place, in the case that politics is usually sewn up?
Okay, I think there are like a number of issues bundled up in what you're asking, and I think I understand where you're coming from. Well, we have the formative stages of a political agenda for animals that's happening. I mean, I think that one of the things we need to realize is that there is an existing political agenda for animals, except that it's the animal industrial complex that is driving that agenda. They're the ones who are deciding what the laws are for animals. And what we need to do is to interrupt and intervene into that process. The point I was trying to make is that I think that we are still quite naive in understanding animal rights as a political issue. that we need to further work to understand that the reason why animals are treated the way they are is more than just because of consumerism and people choosing to buy a set of products. It's there because the law permits it, the law doesn't stop it, and frankly, I don't think everyone is going to be as sympathetic to animals as we are, so therefore you need laws to compel people to behave in a way that is in the animal's interests. I hope I've answered your question for you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is another question. You make me run today.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to say that I totally agree with you concerning the fact that the animal rights movement has to consider itself as a social movement and so act in this way. And I was quite surprised when you told that we should identify ourselves as animal lovers, maybe to understand the nonviolence, etc. But isn't it better for a social movement to act not because this social movement loves just some beings, but because he thinks that this social movement thinks that it is a question of justice. It is not a question of loving or something to do with emotion. For example, I can give the example of the anti-racist movement. They are not anti-racist because they love Asian people or black people. I don't understand why for the animal rights movement we should call ourselves animal lovers. For me it's total nonsense because it's really a question of justice, and as a social movement we have to frame it in this way, that it is something that is wrong, that is an oppression to the animals, and we have to change it. And I think we will even gather more support from the public opinion, because a lot of people in the public opinion don't love animals. Actually, I even think that a lot of people that discovered the anti-speciesist message, they don't love animals, they just agree that it is wrong to treat animals as a resource or as a property, etc. So for me, it should be more something of a justice, like a social movement.
Well, I'm very sympathetic and agree with what you just said. I mean, I apologize if I didn't make myself very clear. I was not suggesting that we call ourselves animal lovers instead of animal rights. I don't see it as a choice between one or the other. My point is that I think that we need to reclaim the name animal lovers so that it has a broader definition of representing the values that we represent as animal rights advocates. And in some respects, it's a bit like gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people reclaim the word queer. Queer was a pejorative until they reclaimed it and said, if that word is going to be used, we're going to define it on our terms. And I think that we can think about redefining animal lover on our terms so that it more broadly speaks to our agenda. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, maybe we can talk afterwards.
But does it make like a little community of animal lovers, like there are, I don't know, ice cream lovers or things like this? It takes away the justice question, I think.
I disagree. I don't think it does take away the justice question, because we can redefine animal loving to be more than just a syrupy, sugary notion of loving animals. I think that we can say animal loving can be more along the lines of animal rights. I don't think also, let's not get too caught up on this point. I'm not saying let's throw out all the animal rights ideology and let's all go around saying that we're animal lovers. I am not saying that. But what I am saying is that when I look around this room and when I talk to people who I meet in the work of advocating for animals, most people share their lives with animals, and at heart they are animal lovers, but they're also animal rights people, and they have been able to unwittingly redefine what it means to be an animal lover in an animal rights context. And that's really what I'm saying, is let's define animal loving, if you like, being an animal lover within the animal rights context. Let's reclaim that back and advocate for it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kim, so much for your talk.